Hello, everyone. I'm Yifei Jiang from Huawei. Here, I'd like to present our work on applying hardware-assisted techniques to I/O virtualization framework. We named this work HA-IOV. We first explain the background and motivation of our work. Then, the HA-IOV architecture is introduced. More details about HA-IOV are described in the following three parts. Finally, we conclude our work and introduce our future work. The ever-increasing demand for high-performance computing in data centers has resulted in the dramatic development of various virtualization environments. I/O virtualization is one of the most crucial components, which targets not only to optimize the utilization of physical resources, but also to enhance the I/O performance. To elevate the I/O virtualization overheads, hardware-assisted techniques are proposed to directly pass through access physical I/O devices, but then complicate the lab migration. Software techniques such as for emulated I/O devices and Paravirtual I/O devices suffer from performance loss due to costly context switch between guest and host. Our work focuses on the four emulated I/O devices and Paravirtual I/O devices. Why guests suffer performance loss while accessing emulated I/O devices implemented in the user level QMA threads? Let's see the whole procedure. Firstly, to access four emulated I/O devices, guests should trip out to QM. And QM will further transform I/O request to the user level by handling exceptions. Thus, context should switch from kernel to the user space. Then, QMA threads process I/O request and return processing I/O results. Context will switch back to QM. QM further returns back to guest through switching context. Finally, the guest resumes. As we can see from the whole procedure, costly context switch between host and guest exist and are unavoidable in current software and hardware architecture. As for Paravirtual I/O devices, which are implemented using I/O thread based on volatile framework, they are also costly context switches. The difference is that the guest trips out to QM and QM send I/O event FD to blocking I/O threads. This is done by sending API to target CPU cores instead of handling exception in the same CPU core. In target CPU core, kernel schedule wakes up the I/O thread to process I/O requests. After the processing, I/O thread sends interrupt back to guest to notify the completion of I/O requests. Guest trip out again to get watch interrupt injected. Of course, this can be optimized by X-less interrupt mechanism, but when guest send I/O request, the overheads caused by guest trapping cannot be avoided. Let's say the we host. The we host propose to elevate I/O processing overheads by adapting kernel threads, but overheads caused by context switch between guest and host still exist. Different from we host the user elevate I/O overheads via shared memory between guest and host. However, it prevents other threads from running on the polling CPU core. When virtual I/O workloads become real, the CPU utilization becomes lower. To elevate I/O path overheads in I/O virtualization framework, as well as improving CPU utilization lowered by polling mode, we introduced the HA-IOV. Note that our techniques also target to avoid complicating the level migration. As mentioned before, when guests access 4 emulated I/O devices, costly context switch between guest and host reduce the performance. Thus, we propose the HA-IOV to elevate the context switch overheads. We do this by directly delegating exception from guest to host user space by passing QM. More details will be described in the following slides. As for Paravirtual I/O devices in kernel and user space, what I/O and vhost require the guest to trap out to send API or send IO event type D to notify what I/O backend and vhost backend, respectively. Particularly, I/O threads running in user space should be scheduled by kernel. This is further cause overheads before processing I/O request. To save the costly I/O path overheads, polling mode in which host user is used. It allows the guest to interact with user-level I/O drivers directly via shared memory between guest and host. However, polling threads prevent other threads running on the polling CPU cores, which lowers the CPU utilization. Here, we propose the HA-IOV. For one thing, virtual event interrupt mechanism is introduced to allow guests to send interrupts without trapping out to QM. For another, user-level interrupt handler, which is for handling virtual event interrupt, can be woken up quickly by hardware-assisted context switch mechanism. From above, HA-IOV can eliminate costly context switch between host and guest. The user-level threads can be woken up quickly. Furthermore, through the combination of VI and HCS, the wasted polling CPU cores become free to run other threads. It can improve the CPU utilization. To validate our ideas, we implement a prototype on the RISC-V systems. In RISC-V architectures, privilege mode is defined as shown in the figure. There are 4 privilege labs and 2 virtualization mode. Guest runs in virtualization mode and host runs in non-virtualization mode. An extension is proposed in RISC-V privilege architecture for adding user live interrupt and exception handler. Interrupts and exceptions can thus be delegated to user level. Hardware can transfer control directly to user-level trap handler without invoking the auto-execution environment. To support HA-IOV, we further extend the N extension with the ability to redirect exception occurs in VS mode or VU mode to U mode, and the ability to allow VS mode or VU mode to be interrupted by the user-level interrupts. Both emulated and Paravirtual I/O devices can benefit from HA-IOV. Next, we will show the more details in following three parts. For emulated virtual I/O devices such as UART, guests trap out when accessing memory region. QM obtains the reason and the date of trap and further transform this information to the user space. QM-TOR or QMA process I/O request according to these informations. After that, control flow returns back to QM and further returns back to guest. As shown in the graph, with the support of hardware, a specific exception raised in guest can be directly redirected to host user space by passing QM. User-level exception handler first save the guest context. Also, some function implemented in QM handle the exception. In our work, they are moved to the host user space. Thus, procedure of obtain exception reason and related data are moved to the host user space. Besides, when kernel traps occur during the I/O processing, new kernel stack should be arranged to avoid blocking the existing kernel stack. To directly redirect exception from guest to the host user space, we extend the N extension. N extension is for adding user-level exception and interrupt handler. In extension, control state registers such as useStatus, useScratch, etc. are used, as shown in the following tables. So, we no longer detail them here. User-level exception handler defined in an extension can only process exception in U mode. We here extend the N extension to be able to handle exception raised in the guest. First, we added a new CSR HUE delegate to allow exceptions raised in guest to be delegated. Recording the previous privilege live and virtualization mode. Control flow in guest can thus be redirected to user space. Also, the control flow should also be able to return back to guest from the host user space directly. At that time, the uReturn instruction is extended with the semantic of alone return to VS mode or VU mode from U mode. Further, to avoid abusing the uReturn instruction, a new field called HUR is added in HStatus. This can prevent normal user threads to jump to any place in guest. This is because the returned address pointed by UEPC and UStatus can be changed without any restriction. Besides, two manual page fault exceptions are added. Those exceptions will also be handled in host user space. When guests access specific memory address of emulated I/O devices by load or store instruction, corresponding exception will be raised. To implement this, a new field called MML is added in PTE. When MMU accesses the PTE at the second stage translation, and the MML is set in PTE, MML page fault will be raised. To evaluate the performance improvement brought by HA-IOV, we perform our experiments on RISC-V systems, which is running on the HiSiLink Qualcomm 920 CPU cores. The host is configured with 4 CPU and 2 GB system memory, where the guest is started up with 1 CPU and 1 GB system memory, which is enough to perform our test. Due to the lack of standardized UART benchmark, we tested the performance of UART by outputting 1 kilo, 10 kilo, 50 kilo, 100 kilo lengths of hello world to the terminal. As we can see from the right figure, the output speed of HA-IOV-based UART achieves near 2 times faster than the original one. Kernel Paravirtual I/O devices, such as we host NIT, can also benefit from HA-IOV. In extending method to accessing kernel Paravirtual I/O devices, guests should trip out to set notifications. In HA-IOV, we propose the VI, which allows the guest set supervisor interrupt without tripping out. Host kernel threads can thus be woken up quickly by eliminating the overhangs of context switch between host and guest. To allow guest to notify kernel threads in the host, each kernel thread for handling supervisor interrupts is tied to a physical virtual event interrupt, which is identified by the VI ID. Guests only need to send the VI request number to the interrupt controller. Then the interrupt controller will transfer the VI request number to the VI ID. Then the mapping information is private by QMA and host kernel. Finally, each VI request number in a guest will be attached to a VI ID on the specific CPU core. More specifically, following steps will be performed to send and deliver supervisor VI. Firstly, guest sends VI by writing VI request to a new added CPU register. The register is allowed to access in guest, so there is no need for guest to tripping out. Then VID is obtained by VI model in CPU to further query the registered mapping information present in the interrupt controller. Finally, when the target CPU ID is found, a physical interrupt identified by VID is delivered to the host kernel threads in target CPU. To show the advantage of HA-IOV, we perform our test using the vhost NIT. The experiment environment is sum to the 1 to evaluate the UART. NetPerf is chosen as the benchmark to evaluate the performance of vHostNet and HA-IOV-based vHostNet. As we can see from the red fingers, bandwidth in TCP and UDP of vHostNet can be improved by over 100% when message sizes are small. Finally, to improve CPU utilization, polling mode is replaced by virtual event interrupt and hardware-assisted context switch in our approach. In the polling mode, guests interact with user-level I/O devices via shared memory between guest and host. Water banking thus are implemented as polling threads, which still keep other threads running on the polling CPU cores. When I/O requests become real, this lowers the utilization of polling CPU cores. In HA-IOV, guests interact with user-level devices by using live virtual event interrupt. Guest is allowed to send user-level VI without tripping out to QEM. Water banking is implemented in user-level interrupt handlers. It can be triggered by the VI instead of being scheduled by the kernel. It can enhance the responsiveness. Hardware-assisted context switch is thus extended in the CPU and interrupt controller for swapping the memory space and data structure of user-level interrupt handlers by passing the kernel. To support the user-level interrupt, the request, including Uscratch, UTVector, SUScratch, and SUATP, should also be provided in the interrupt controller. Uscratch saves the user-level data structure of the interrupt handler, where UTVector stores the entry address of the interrupt handler. To achieve faster responsiveness when handling user-level interrupts, request, SUScratch, and SUTP are extended. The request, SUScratch, is for saving the kernel data structure of the user-level interrupt handler, where the SUTP is for saving the memory space of the user-level interrupt handler. When a user-level virtual event interrupt is sent by the guest, interrupt controller creates the map information to find the VI physical number. Also, requests mentioned above in the target CPU cores are overwritten by the interrupt controller. Then the interrupt controller delivers the VID to the target CPU cores. When target CPU cores handles the user-level interrupts, hardware-assisted context switch mechanism in CPU further swap views in SUScratch SATP with the SScratch SATP. The critical context, including memory space and data structures of the interrupted user thread and the user-level interrupt handlers, are swapped by the hardware-assisted context switches. To handle the user-level interrupts, corresponding software interrupt handler is proposed, and its architecture is shown in the red fingers. A user-level interrupt handler is composed of an interrupt handler and a user thread, both of which sharing the same memory space and kernel data structure, which the interrupt handler is triggered to run. Contexts are saved in its user stack. The saved context will be restored when returned to the interrupted thread. During the execution of the interrupt handler from the view of kernel or CPU, the interrupted thread is still running and it is only regarded as interrupted instead of being scheduled out. This is done by showing the schedule information of the interrupted thread with the interrupter handler. However, the CPU core sometimes is not in the U mode, and this may postpone the handling of the user-level interrupts. Thus, for one thing, the period of VS mode, VU mode is defined to be lower than the period of U mode. User-level interrupts are able to interrupt the running guest by switching virtualization mode to non-virtualization mode. For another, if the target CPU core is in HA mode, for example, the idle task is running, a doorbell interrupt is raised to schedule user threads. Then the interrupt handler is triggered by the user level VI to run I/O process by interrupting the user thread. Due to the lack of DBDK and SBDK support in RISC-V systems, we evaluate the user level VI using multi-block. We use FIO benchmark to test the read-write, rand-read, and rand-write performance of guests on the basis of multi-block and HA-IOV-based multi-block. From the right figures, we can see that HA-IOV gains the average 20% performance improvement when message size are small. Also, the performance in evaluation results we obtained are still unstable. We believe it is caused by the software kernel emulator. Thus, a FPGA-based platform that supports RISC-V virtualization is needed for faster validate the new ideas. In this talk, we propose hardware-assisted techniques for I/O virtualization, including user-level exception redirection, virtual event interrupt, and hardware-assisted context switch. We name it HA-IOV. HA-IOV enhances performance of full emulated I/O devices and Paravirtual I/O devices in both the kernel and user space. Besides, it improves CPU utilization by freeing up polling CPU cores. There are some future work. The VM map querying hardware methods in current implementation prototypes is NIVIO. So the latency of querying VM map information deserves future optimization. Also, since with VI is attached to a physical CPU core, CPU affinity policies for VI should be provided for load balancing. Due to the alteration on privilege registers such as UEPC and UStatus may cause some security issues. Much more work on enhancing the security of HA-IOV should be taken into consideration. Okay, this is all our work. Thank you.